Hello and welcome to Dialogues on India's Quest. My guest today is a practicing psychoanalyst who's taught at universities in India, Europe and America. He's won numerous honors, including the Boyer Award for Psychological Anthropology. He's been a National Fellow with the Baba Fellowship, the Nehru Fellowship and the ISSR Fellowship. I'm delighted to welcome Sudhir Kakar. Sudhir, what really is a job of a psychoanalyst working in the larger realm that you do, both in terms of, some of your time is spent dealing with patients and sort of helping people in their sort of coping with their everyday lives, and you also spend a lot of time writing on issues like violence, intimate relations, and what are these two functions, sort of two roles that you play?
Well, one is the clinical role, Rajiv, and the clinical role is very simply a helping role. I won't call it a healing role, but you help people to get to terms with their conflicts, their problems, to discover forms of creativity or mastery in themselves. And the other is the writing role, where one uses the psychoanalytic theories, also adapts them to understand where we are in our social reality, so the Indian reality, and that has been always my great interest of what is our culture all about, or cultural psychology. Now both play into each other. Without the practice, what my, not patients, one calls them clients, what they teach me, I won't be able to develop the hypothesis to test in the wider reality for writing.
How long have you been practicing clinically?
Now it's 25 years, it's coming on to 25 years clinically, and I think writing has been slightly longer, so about 27, 28 years.
You trained to be an engineer and you went to Germany, and how and why did psychoanalysis enter your life? It was quite a switch, wasn't it?
It was a switch in the sense because when I was growing up, and we are talking of 50s, and it's 1959, 58 when I did my bachelor's in engineering, you had actually only three professions in our kind of middle class, the medicine, engineer, or the administrative services. My father was in the administrative services, so that was out. I didn't want to compete with him at all. Medicine, I couldn't stand the sight of blood, so engineering was the only profession left, so which I did engineering. But I always knew that I was not going to do it for long. So after about 2 years, and when I went to Germany in a shipyard, I knew I was not going to do engineering, and what I wanted to do was philosophy, which of course created a great deal of consternation at home. I mean, nobody's ever earned money from philosophy. So we had letters going up and down, but since I was away from home and pressures, and from letters, people can't exert that much pressure. So that we came to a compromise that I would do economics instead, that economics is between engineering and philosophy, and maybe one can earn money. So I did my master's, 5 years I spent in Germany doing economics. But of course I knew I didn't want economics too, and that was a compromise. But I'd already started studying, reading psychology, and of course literature, which psychoanalysis is very close to. And then when the chance came, which was in India, when I met a psychoanalyst, a very well-known person who was writing a book on Gandhi, and then I asked him, listen, I want to be do this, what you are doing, how do I do it? And he said, well, just finish your doctorate, come and work with me and we'll arrange. So I really shifted at the age of 30 to my career, which I've always wanted since the age of 16 or 17.
What does a psychoanalyst do?
There are three really kind of differentiations which one can do: psychologist, psychiatrist, and psychotherapist. Psychologist normally is what is an academic degree. You have your master's in psychology, your PhD in psychology, and you teach or study psychological things of behavior, of cognition. There are people called clinical psychologists who would then practice psychology in a clinical sense. Many of them would be doing testing of various kinds, IQ testing of various personality kind of things. But some of them will also do therapy. So when a clinical psychologist does therapy, further trains for then he becomes a psychotherapist. So psychotherapist can be a psychologist, but he or she can come from any other profession, social work, etc., and then treats or heals or deals with emotional disorders by one of these psychotherapy schools, and there are many of them. Psychiatrist is someone who has studied medicine, has specialized in psychiatry, and really, in India at least, most of them would be dealing with mental, emotional disorders from the organic viewpoint, mostly with treatment with drugs. So these are the three differentiations. Psychoanalyst is one kind of psychotherapist, a psychotherapist who has as basis the school of Freud, Sigmund Freud. So that would be a psychoanalyst.
In the years that you've been practicing largely in India, though you've been teaching all over the world, what changes have you felt in terms of the willingness of people to reach out to therapy, and perhaps in the kinds of problems they confront?
That has changed a great deal. I mean, I remember 25 years ago, anyone who came was a pagal, and there was great deal of stigma. You came very secretly, you never told people at all, even your friends didn't know about it. And of course, if I met any one of my clients outside, it was understood that we completely ignore each other, we don't even acknowledge each other's existence. That has been changing tremendously, and especially in the last 3-4 years, I find the demand for some kind of psychotherapy, right starting from the agony aunt columns of newspapers and magazines to the discussions of it in TV shows, etc., has increased tremendously. The stigma is still there, but much, much less.
In what ways do you feel that a Western view of the mind really has an application in India in treating conditions and problems that people here might have?
The Western view of the mind, origins by itself do not damn any kind of system. I think you're quite right in alluding to the fact that origins do influence a system, but otherwise one would say, one could think of monks having a conversation in Japan in 5th century, that Buddhist meditation that is from Kerala, how does it apply here? So you see, so that I wouldn't say origins are the thing, but you have to do some kind of adaptations. There are some universal problems, I think, human beings have by the virtue of being born as helpless children and needing and growing up with adults. So relationships, the very important relationships with parents, siblings, these are almost kind of universal, and the pain associated with these ones. They cause the great pleasure, but also great pain. So these are kind of universal things which people come to, whether it's West or India or anywhere else. So what you do is that the universal ones, the view of the mind, I don't think differs too much. There are some kind of things where this culture part does come in. Questions of, well, we can talk about it later, of autonomy, of how much individuality, how much relationships, how much a family should control you, how much you should have your own way. There, I think the whole culture part starts coming in.
What are some of the dominant cultural aspects that you feel that people confront today as opposed to 25 years ago in terms of your, let's just stay with your clinical experience for now. Mm-hmm. What shifts do we see? And how much of these shifts you think are perhaps responsible, or is there a relationship in the fact that India is now free country, we have moved away from colony, and there is greater freedom and an opportunity to sort of express oneself. Do you see sort of relationships of this kind?
Yes, I think there, looking back, I would say there are some kind of relationships. I think one big change we are seeing, at least in the metropolitan cities, and that's really where the psychotherapies, the Western style psychotherapies are concentrated, is the whole problem of individuality or individuation, or put in other terms, a cast of mind where the family plays much less role, the conflicts around that have become much more. Do I wish for greater autonomy? How much autonomy do I wish for? Versus obligations towards the family. I think that is the negotiations which have started taking place much, much more now, in a much more conscious way, in much more reflective way than they used to be earlier, where the things were accepted much more. That is, I think, one of the broader changes which have taken place, also because of, certainly also because of opportunities. If your whole economic well-being and your what you were doing depended as being member of the family, then you didn't move out of it, you didn't have that opportunity. But if there are opportunities to move out, whether in professions or geographically, then these kind of conflicts can also start. So that certainly plays into it. Another big change, I think one of the biggest ones, is women. I think that is the much greater individuation of women, of their much greater sense of autonomy. That I think has been one of the biggest changes, because I think a lot of our earlier part or the earlier cultural life rested on many sacrifices which many women had to make, and many women are refusing to make those sacrifices. So that is of course bringing the whole system again into some kind of turbulence.
I think there's sort of two different ways, two different areas here, sort of the family and women. If we were to look at the problem of the family, would you say that psychoanalysis, or the kind of therapy that you're doing, is really is seeking to help people cope to what is really a reactive situation? There's a societal change, puts pressure on the family. I'm miserable. I come to you to try and come to terms with my situation.
Psychoanalysis itself is perhaps the most strongly individual-oriented therapy. The individual is the center. So my responsibility as analyst is only to the person who's sitting in front of me. That I'm not responsible directly for parents, not interest for parents, family, society, nothing at all. The interests of this individual are the most important for me. And of course, what one tries to do is to increase the freedom of choice. It's not increasing coping or happiness, to give the person after a lot of talk, that he or she gets this feeling that there are choices available. Then what he or she chooses, whether in the family, whether to cope, adapt, and what degree, are absolutely choices of the person. But he or she has to know that there are these choices available.
Do you ever get involved or play a role in sort of the morality of those choices?
No, psychoanalysis is in that sense, an amoral profession, in the sense, because morality is what so many people suffer from. Ethics is different, but morality, the sense of oppressive, where you have no choice, that kind of morality is something which psychoanalysis, I think, through its history, has undermined and tried to undermine. That morality are the kind of, those gods are not its gods. That the iconoclasm is a very important part of it. So that is certainly not a part of psychoanalysis.
Could you elaborate the difference between morality and ethics?
Morality is, again, I think what you feel is imposed, what you have to do. Ethics is what you have chosen to do. So I think the difference is really the freedom of choice. The actions can be the same, but what is inside how you do them, whether you have freely choose to do them or whether you feel as it an imposition.
So would it be fair to say that when a patient comes to you with a problem within the family, that are you sort of empowering him, helping him to understand, to gain insights, to find solutions? What is the interaction that you have with him? Our traditional image is that he comes back on a couch and he sort of lies down on a couch and you sort of listen passively and allow him to articulate his thoughts and ideas, and you neutrally steer him so that he's able to see reality for what it is. Is that a fair description?
It is a fair description. Yeah, in fact, I think it's a very fair description. What you are trying to do is that, yes, he or she talks of his or her life, but there are some kind of blind spots which he or she may not see, and some of them are not even perhaps conscious, but you start seeing some patterns and you point out those patterns which he or she has missed. So you make the story complete instead of some things which were not hanging together, so that it becomes a coherent story, a consistent story for him and her. And then of course if you have your story, you are free to, this is me, now I can choose.
Does it sometimes, but how do you penetrate the layers of one's self-deceptions, perhaps?
I would hate to say that I penetrate them. It is always seen as absolutely joint work, that we try to penetrate the layers of self-deception, the layers which are which are really imposed and are not your own, which you've thought are your own. So yes, all kind of layers of absences which are then to be filled.
But again, as a layperson, aren't there disorders where people are not able to confront reality, and when you confront reality, it's so much of a shock that leads to a disorder too?
Well, psychoanalysis is really limited not to the very kind of what is called the psychotic disorders, which people generally call madness, where there's complete break with reality. Psychoanalysis cannot deal with it. You really need to have kind of quite a bit of healthy functioning, where you can talk, where you can see, and where when disturbing news are brought, you will be upset and anxious, but you will be able to take it in. So you need kind of an intelligent, reflective person. In fact, unfortunately, it is a treatment for very healthy people.
You know, you mentioned the clinical role,
yeah.
and we read so much these days of work with drugs, the biochemistry of the brain, of Prozac, and a whole range of chemicals that are used to change personality in some ways. In your experience, what is the relationship between a biochemical treatment of depression, say, and a psychoanalytical approach?
Well, you see, luckily human beings are neither mind nor body; they are both. So, if that one, I think everyone notices, if you are depressed, the biologist will say, aha, this chemical in the brain, which they'll test and find out its level has gone down. Very true. But your shoulders will start sagging, your voice will go down. So there are both together what one calls a dialogical between body and the mind. So you can start the treatment either on the bodily changes, you start that will improve the other, or on the other way, which will also improve the biological part. So since we are so intimately connected, the body and mind, that you can start the treatment anywhere, which will kind of improve the whole person. Now, the biological drugs in some kind of things are much more effective, while they go much more strongly. The mind part or the therapy part, there are resistances because people do not want to change. In fact, who wants to change except a wet baby? So otherwise, so there is great resistance to change, and that takes a much longer time. And of course, the investment, both emotional, financial, is much more. So in some cases, some kind of cases, the biological
So why not just pop pills?
The pop pills will not take care of where your story has gone wrong. It will kind of take you away from your story. It will take you away from the causes of it. It will remove all the symptoms. And many say that is all what is needed. That is all what it is all about. But this is kind of a philosophical difference between the two kind of approaches, is that you do not treat just the symptoms, but you would like to see what led to the symptoms.
In the Eastern traditions and in the Indian tradition, we have the most sophisticated and complex mind training techniques. What role does that play in changing attitudes and coping with problems?
I think they are very, very effective ones, the Indian or the Eastern, let's say, the mind training ones. They, of course, also treat the whole person through the mind, because that's your bodily part. In fact, we combine it often very well. I mean, many of the yoga schools, etc., is a very good combination of both body and mind part of it. The difference between the Indian or the Eastern and the psychotherapeutic ones is idea or the focus is what is mind, what is the self there. In the Western parts is the biographical self, which is important. Your biography is what you are. Here in the Eastern ones, it is not the biography. The biography is completely ignored. There is a notion of a mind removed from biography, which is the focus. So the focus of what the mind is too different. Many Western psychotherapists would say that does not exist, which I do not agree with. And the Eastern would say the biographical one is important but not that important, so there would be kind of conflicts on that, or at least disagreements on that. But both are really much more the mind.
You've did a book called The Analyst and the Mystic, in which you looked at Ramakrishna from a perspective of a psychoanalyst. What were some of your conclusions in that kind of exploration?
Well, that kind of exploration, you see, being an Indian psychoanalyst means you are kind of writing at two levels. I was once at one level discussing with my Western psychoanalytic colleagues who have looked upon mystics and people, especially kind of florid mystics like Ramakrishna, whose ecstasies, etc., were kind of to them scandalous, as they would say, it is completely psychotic. So I was arguing on one level with them that this is not psychotic, that we can make very good sense out of them.
How do you make sense of, Sri Ramakrishna went through a series of experiences, peak experiences of sadhanas, where he would, he would tie a tail around on his back and then prance around as if he was Hanuman, or he felt he experienced the body of Christ and Muhammad. To appearances, there's a very fine line between religious ecstasy and what we would perceive as being madness.
Yeah, well, you're right about the fine line, and because to appearances both can look very much the same. The differences, I think, are twofold. That in madness, not two, I think there are two or three things where you can see the differences. In madness, that part, what you call the ecstasy, or they would call the psychopathology part, is not a willed one. It takes you over, and you can't get out of it. It is out of your control. In the mystic's ecstasy, it is much more controllable. Second, the ties with other people, affectionate ties, and that is one of the very big criterias for health, mental health in Western psychotherapy, psychoanalysis, is to love and work both well. Mystics' capacity for love and work are very much heightened, and one sees it, the amount of love which is kind of radiated by them and the disciples, etc., whereas both those capacities are completely impaired in the psychotic. So these are two very big differences. What happens is, what you look at the mystic is really that there is, you see, all kind of normal people, we have boundaries between waking and sleeping, night and day, adult, child, all kind of boundaries, inner, outer. Now in creative people, those boundaries are much more permeable. That in artists and various kind of other creative people. And I think those thin boundaries of the mind is what a mystic has, which a psychotic does not have. So what Ramakrishna does, at that moment he is becoming Hanuman or whatever else, because he can cross those boundaries, but he can cross them back also. It's not that he stays in those, and that is one of the I think, very, very big difference. The best metaphor, of course, I think, which I use there is that the current, psychic current, which throws through your mind in full force in both these madness and in mystic ecstasy. In one case, it short circuits the brain, which is madness, and the other it illuminates, and which is the mystic.
Would you say that in the case of Ramakrishna, certainly, that it involved an enormous capacity to experience both pleasure and pain, the pain of yearning and the ecstasy of experience?
Yes.
Is there a parallel with that for the psychotic, or the psychotic just experiences the pain and not the ecstasy? Or
one can't say that, you see, because you have to be really in the psychotic's mind to see that. But yes, but generally the painful one, are much, much greater ones. And also, as I said, it is not to experience, to be able to experience the world and yourself. I think that is really the goal of psychoanalysis, as well as any kind of mystical part also, that you have to become so open that you start seeing the world afresh. The things you hear have a different music. The things you see are looked at differently. The capacity to experience is very, very important, and Ramakrishna's capacity to experience, so to say, was, I think, one of the highest in that sense, and what a mystic also aims for, and what I think creative artists also aim for a way, and which I think all psychoanalysis also really aims for in helping the client. So it's not only coping with problems, but how to experience in a much more lively way with your whole mind, body and soul, rather than just going through life dimly.
Do you find that the practice of psychoanalysis sometimes, what does it do to you personally? You're familiar with the vocabulary, the techniques, the technology, as it were, of working with the mind. How do you relate to that yourself in your own life? Do you find that you're psychoanalyzing yourself all the time?
No, because that would be awful. That would be awful, because of course, what happens is that, you see, it is like anyone else. A mistake is a mistake only when he's being a mistake, not otherwise. We always attribute that to all your 24 hours. A poet is a poet when he's writing poetry, or he's being a poet, not all the rest of the time.
I thought there's a special sensibility that comes to being a mystic or to being a poet, and the boundaries are very fine, and so that's the kind of person you are.
That kind of sensibility spreads, but you are not really exercising that sensibility all the time, not when you are eating or with your children. So that sensibility may be there, but it is not at its highest. That is only being exercised at that particular time when you are being an analyst.
But does that make you perhaps more vulnerable, or calls for greater discipline, that you don't apply your techniques and insights too much on yourself?
Absolutely. I mean, because one of being an analyst is of being healthy in that sense is also of not reflecting too much on yourself and no kind of self-obsession. Life should be mostly lived on its own part. It should live by itself mostly. I mean, if you are too much self-scrutiny and all is not a great thing, and that is the danger of the anti-gut profession. That is also something which you need. I mean, sometimes when you get your blind spots, etc., then you have to apply those techniques.
What happens when an analyst needs analysis? He goes to another analyst?
He goes to another analyst. In fact, in the early years of analysis, it was almost de rigueur that analyst after every 5-10 years went kind of a refresher to another one, because you do develop kind of blind spots which are unavoidable, because you also have as much an unconscious as anyone else. There are some things which are painful for you, which you will not want to see if they're coming out in the client, and when it keeps on being repeated and you kept on being hit on the head by the patient, why don't you see this? Then you start thinking, why don't I see it? What is my problem? So you have to do that kind of self-analysis all the time.
You'd mentioned the mistake, and we talked about creativity. In some measure, these are all facets that we all aspire to. Right. That we have these qualities. To what degree do you feel these? Well, let me ask you this question in the context of Ramakrishna again, because you've studied this. That how much of this is genetic? How much of it is comes from the environment? How much of it is karmic for you? Not just purely from your academic learning, but as an Indian living in India and working here largely. These are so much a part of our ingrained experience and our assumptions.
That's right. I don't have an answer. I think there's the mixture, the combination of what is the genetic part. What you are asking about is, you're quite right, that I think we are all born with the great capacity for creative experiencing. And that, of course, one sees in the little babies, and when they look at the world with a kind of delight and the pleasure and what the world is, a discovery, to recreate or to rediscover that kind of pleasure in adulthood about the world, to recreate the world, comes to very few people. The mystics, I would say, yes, and some kind of artist.
You've also done a study on childhood in India.
Yeah.
And are there sort of areas where the childhood experience in India is distinctive and hence makes us as Indian adults perhaps different to other communities and societies? And in what ways?
Well, I think, you see, what happens, I think, is that every society or every culture has a limited number of concepts which tell the child of what is the world like, what are good and evil and good prototypes, and what is actually a good life, unconscious kind of a life plan. And these concepts the culture gives to a child, or a society gives to a child, mostly through stories. There can be legends, myths, stories told by others, fables. So all that comes to the child, that this is what the world is like. So every culture in that sense is distinctive.
What are some of the sort of dominant, typical stories that are distinctive for our culture?
Well, I think one thing distinctive for our culture is, the worldview that of course, that the world is there is a quest. And if you are very good, whatever way you are, etc., you are going to get something more and higher way of experiencing, and that whether it is moksha, etc., that it's a quest. You go higher and higher with the kind of obstacles come on the way, but if you deal with them, etc. So it's a kind. There is a romantic vision of the quest of life.
So the higher is not merely a material one.
No,
but it is something.
It is much more higher. And some other cultures wouldn't have this romantic quest, and they would have very kind of ironic one. There is nothing at all after that. All that you have is here. Take that. Take the cash, let the credit go, kind of thing, which one. So there are these different kinds of. So we have, I think, a romantic quest in the Indian culture, which we get as a child. That is certainly there. Then, of course, we get a view of our body, that the bodies are not. That comes from our medicine, Ayurvedic part of it. That there's a very intimate interconnection of our bodies with the whole world around. There are exchanges taking place. That it is not a kind of a fortress in itself. So things are not only happening inside the body, whereas some other culture where then biology would be much more important, and we'll have a much more metaphysical kind of biology of influences from outside on the body, which includes then the stars, stones, everything is influencing everything else. So this kind of a fluid way of looking at the world. So that is also would be part of our culture.
Yet it seems that as India develops and India is educated, these stories are being lost.
Yeah, and in fact, with that, I think some of our distinctiveness of that would be lost. I think it will be kept, and it may kind of flower again. But yes, with the loss of these stories, we would be losing very distinct way of looking at the world, distinct way of saying what is evil and what is good, and what is and what is a life plan all about. What are our distinctive life plan?
But what implications does this change have for? Well, I mean, it's an American ideal, the pursuit of happiness. I'm not even sure that it is our ideal, but it seems to be well, is that an ideal for a psychoanalyst to encourage his patient to pursue happiness?
No, because you see, happiness one cannot. There is no kind of abstract or objective ways of looking at happiness. Everyone has such a different idea of happiness inside when you really come inside that you cannot say the pursuit of freedom. I think if one was, that would be the psychoanalytic idea, the pursuit of inner freedom.
So just to go back to this change that we now see, because these stories are sort of receding deeper into our unconsciousness. What implications has that had in the areas that you have looked at? Relationships, it is something that interests you. And we'll talk about violence. I think that's something else that you've done a lot of work on. What tangible impact has that had on relationships, for example?
Well, relationships, okay, let me put it this way. There is a very nice, I think it is Schopenhauer's originally, and Schopenhauer was very much influenced by Indian philosophy. He compared relationships to porcupines on a cold night, that they come near to seek warmth, but then they prick each other, so it pains, so they move away. And that this keeps on repeating whole night till an optimum is found where the pain of nearness and the coldness of distance are somehow balanced. Now, our culture was on the side of we'll rather have the pain of nearness in family rather than the coldness of distance. That, I think, is shifting. We are getting people now, I mean, in cities, etc., who are much more prepared to have the coldness of distance rather than the pain of nearness. So that kind of tolerance in relationships, families, etc., is going down.
But isn't this, would you say that this is a prevailing a point of view, the pain of nearness? I mean, at one level, you seem to suggest that we need human beings. There is sort of the natural craving for merging with either God or another human being. I don't quite understand the pain of nearness.
Well, the pain of nearness always is that you have to give up some of your wishes, needs, desires, etc., with the other human being who is also expressing his or her wishes, needs, or desires. If I only want to keep on stressing on my needs, desires, then there's going to be a conflict between the two, and that is the pain. But if I'm not really that much interested in the other person, if I kind of put a psychological distance between the two, then I may not have to go through that. Then I can go through with this is me, this is what I want, and that's it. So the pain of nearness is really pain of having your wishes, desires not being realized, not gratified.
You've also done a book on intimate relations. What does your sort of, this view do to notions of love?
Which love? You mean?
Well, I think sort of both between erotic love, spiritual love, love for God,
yeah.
and love in the sense of compassion, of concern for others, where you're willing to experience the pain of nearness. Well, let's look at the pain of nearness as an act of love.
Yes, I think it's only in kind of the highest ecstasy, or not ecstasy, the throes of love where you can experience the pain of nearness, where you experience it very gladly. And I think that is common. I don't think there's much difference between spiritual love and so-called erotic love. I think they're all the same. That when you are really in the throes of that, that pain is very much almost welcome because it is not your own. What is love? Well, love to me would be well, I think love is really the search for transcendence, transcendence of getting out of your body, because being born in the world is being born into your body, locked into your mind, and love is I think the only we have for creative people and mystics and all, leaving them aside, but for the rest of us, and that's why its great power is that being in love is the time, and especially in sexual love, in erotic love, when for moments you are out of your body, you are out of your own mind, merged with the other one, and that is its great attraction, its great power. In fact, when people say that psychoanalysis of Freudian, it is a psychology of love. It is not psychology of sex, as everyone says. In fact, I think sex is because it makes you transcend yourself much more. I mean, it is the very strong feeling, bodily feeling of that transcendence. Transcendence is the primary part. Sexuality helps in doing that. So I would see it as reverse relations.
There is this whole the changing attitudes to love, and again, sort of jump back into the societal impact of globalization, of the intermingling of cultures. What kinds of conflict has that created for the community in India? And we are looking at urban communities who are exposed to that kind of...
Well, strangely enough, our arrangements, our societal arrangements have, marriage arrangements have not been for love. I mean, that has been, our family has been always different. It has not been organized around the couple, but rather much more on the parent-son relationship and all the rest around it. And that is, of course, coming under strain, but it has not broken yet, and that shows from all kind of surveys and studies that still arranged marriages are preferred one. So the marriage relationship is not still seen as a love relationship. So love is still very much in the fantasy, in the stories, in cinema or wherever it is, and in one's plans, and not plans, but fantasies. So that has not changed too much, I think, but there is in the urban middle class where the couple is becoming an important one as the center of the family, and that I think that change will take place and is going to take place much more. There then the whole part of the love and would change so much that you are going to put much more demands on your partners, because they are now become who are going to supply all needs of yours, whether emotional, physical, all kind of well-being ones. So the demands on partners with love as being center of marriage are going to get much, much stronger, are getting much stronger, and with it, of course, the disappointments, and with it, of course, then the pain of the nearness again.
What sort of implications does this shift have for the community as a whole? Not just not just in me as an individual coping with my personal relationship, but what possibilities does it hold out for the larger society? Is it going to empower women?
It has empowered women. I think that it has done. It has empowered women in the urban classes. I think all changes which take place, some sections get empowered, some get disempowered. I think maybe societal relations are a zero-sum game. I mean, not everyone gains in that. The women's empowerment is, I think, a very, very welcome sign, and which one has started seeing girl children are very, very differently treated in the urban middle classes. We are not talking about the rest of the part. Where it will have difficulties is with the parents part of it. So the age one, the older people may get much more disadvantaged than they are now, because if that relationship, man-woman relationship, is central, and the women's demands, rightly so, are much greater than they were earlier, then a lot of energy of both the husband and the wife are going to be spent on each other, dealing with these demands and needs, and much less is available for the rest of the family. And that couple may include the children, but all the rest. So in that kind of extended family sense, or the older generations, etc., they may stand to lose out.
Why do you think that we are seeing, and I refer now to your study on violence, why do you think that we are seeing a spurt or an increase in both public violence that happens in the community and within families interpersonally? What is prompting this in terms of the external changes, and what pressures are this putting on these sort of changes putting on people that prompts this explosion, perhaps?
Well, I think one part I think you've already mentioned, the kind of unmooring which is taking place. We had for some time, long time, a lot of external regulators of conduct, what is right, what is wrong. Many of them are being unmoored in the migrations which are taking place. You go away out from the family, your ecological, cultural, family niches, where you are alone, or you have to make your own decisions. You cannot kind of call up on people only. Then there is sense of loss of those, it was such a happy time before, where am I now? All the various kind of in the urban megalopolises, uncertainties about new professions coming out, you are losing out on the old professions. So any kind of pride in your craft identities, all they are going down. All these do create feelings of helplessness, loss on one hand, and also what psychoanalysis or analysts called narcissistic injuries knocks on your self-esteem. And all these then need some kind of way to restore that self-esteem, and mostly through action, and often that is a violent action. I mean, if I'm feeling bad, it often restores my self-esteem by going and hitting someone on the head to make me feel again an efficacious and, well, fully functioning being.
To what extent do you feel these shifts are a product of changing economic policies, of changing technology, which the media makes possible, a shrinking world? What kind of impact do you think these are having? Is there a correlationship that you see?
Well, when we talk of modernization or globalization, I think we are talking of changes in economics, changes in markets. The markets are, all India is becoming one market, changes in technologies. I think they are all kind of linked, and these are really the forces of change which impinge upon the individuals and on the families and on communities.
But is this something that you see as evolutionary? Because surely every generation has perceived its own set of problems. So is it just that we have a different set of problems and predicaments now, or has substantively the quality of our lives in terms of the equilibrium and the sense of balance been shifted?
Yes, I think you're quite right about that. Every generation perceives its own as real time of change, and all the past was very calm and was very cool. There was no change at all. And so that, I think you are quite right. Whether objectively there are these differences, when change can be managed is that's what you would call an evolutionary change, that it can be, it always causes upset part, but it leads to growth, and you are managing it. The thing is whether the change has become, it's no longer change but turbulence, whether it has entered a turbulent phase where the capacities to manage, at least whether it is true or not is different, but whether people perceive or have this feeling that it is becoming unmanageable. Now, whether that perception has increased, you see, psychologically it is not interesting in what happens to you, but what you think is happening to you. Psychologically, only that is interesting. So whether we think what is happening to us is become turbulent and is unmanageable, that I think has increased more than that. Whether the changes have increased, one doesn't know. That's very difficult to measure.
So for us to become a more, with a professional psychoanalyst, you struggle for the right word. One is tempted to say, well, for us to be happier, do you feel that the individual still has the capacity to achieve that, or should we be looking at governments to change economic policies that facilitate integration of the family, because that is an important value? Which sort of view do you...
By calling me a psychoanalyst, you've already got the answer. The individual is where the change is, the individual is where it will happen. All the other facilitators, etc., I am always very, very skeptical about those kind of changes. I think the increase of self-reflection, the increase of consciousness in individuals is where it really occurs, where it lies. All the rest is morality for me.
To what extent did you believe in sort of like the Buddhist notion that we all really suffer from ignorance, that the inherent wisdom is there, and it's just that our consciousness is clouded by veils of ignorance, and all that is needed is for the ignorance to lift, and natural wisdom will flower?
Well, this is very much where psychoanalysis has picked up from the Buddhist notion. This is exactly what the psychoanalytic notion is, how to remove the veils of ignorance. Maybe there would be differences of where this ignorance comes from, but the agenda is exactly the same.
So in Western psychoanalytical theory, where does this ignorance come from?
In Western psychoanalytic theory, it comes from early childhood, where it got covered by when you did not have the discrimination, where you took on from other people, caretakers, etc., their views, their ideas of what is right, wrong, etc., including which were not in your own interests, etc. And some of them that you could not judge. So you have old scripts running in your mind which are no longer applicable.
Is there a possibility that those old scripts come from previous lives?
That is, in psychoanalysis, no, because it does not believe in previous life, but karma very much. Karma very much. If one can think of karma of your forgotten life, then early childhood is a forgotten life. So the first 3 years or first 4 years, which psychoanalysis considers as the most important, is a previous life, so to say, and its karmic influences are much stronger than the karmic influences you'll get. When karma in psychoanalysis would be fantasies, thoughts, actions, all which are now forgotten, and their repercussions or their traces are which are making you quite unhappy, or often unhappy.
To what extent would we then sort of blame our parents for our angsts? And
you can't really blame parents because they did it according to their karma. I mean, they did it there. So one thing is also how to get away from blaming the parents, and really consciousness means to come to a conclusion, this is what it had to be. My parents were my parents, I was I, there is nothing, past cannot be changed. All I can do is change the effects of the past on the present.
But that is a very sort of Eastern philosophical
It is
position.
very much psychoanalytics. I'm giving you very orthodox psychoanalysis.
Sudhir, what are your plans now? What are you working on, and what are you writing?
Well, since I've been 25 years in this field of psychoanalysis and writing about psychoanalytic things, and I think there's time for me has come for a change, my last one, I hope. Again, I am a restless kind of a soul, have always been. So I've decided that now from this year onwards, I'm going to devote my maximum time to writing, and in fact, try writing fiction. So just finished a novel which comes out next year, and I hope I will add, or at least do much more in the novel writing than the other kinds of writing, which, as I said, because the danger, of course, is if you do anything for too long, the danger is of repeating yourself, and I have intimation that I might start repeating myself in psychoanalysis.
What about the psychoanalytical practice? Is that something that you continue? And how much of it do you do? What percentage of your time goes into that?
I have reduced it greatly. It used to be much more. At the moment, it is only people I've had for a long time. I don't take new people at all. But the ones who I've had for a long time, who are now kind of about to finish or go away, so those are the only ones. So that's not much. That's about 12 to 14 hours a week. And by next year, I want to reduce it very much.
And in what ways do you think that the approach to psychoanalysis as a form of therapy is changing in India? And what value does it have for the rural people, in a sense, that we tend to restrict put our blinkers on and just look at urban problems and urban predicaments?
Yeah. Well, I think psychoanalysis has been everywhere, including in its place of origin in Europe, West, a very kind of an elite base. The amount of time, investment needed, it is much more like meditation. It is a rational meditation, so to say. One would say, well, maybe there are other rational meditation. It's meditation of two people with the analyst together. So it is really a Western meditation, and that has always been for an elite kind. Its main objective has also not really been of healing of disorders, that they come naturally as a part of the meditation. I mean, Freud himself also didn't think himself primarily as a healer, but much more as a kind of an intellectual adventurer. So that is always, it has been restricted. It doesn't have place. So, but other psychotherapies, which are group psychotherapies, which are often based on psychoanalytical principles or are informed by what life is all about, what mind is all about, and then how to kind of bring them to larger number of people, that can happen, and that will happen.
Would you say that the poor, and unfortunately we do sort of equate the poor with the uneducated, because they have a different intellectual vocabulary, perhaps, experience pleasure and pain differently?
No. They do not experience pleasure and pain differently. They attribute different causes to pleasure and pain. Okay, I think there's one very important difference, and it's not India, I think a difference which goes through all countries. Where does pain come from? Suffering, psychological suffering, that's what we are talking about, mental suffering mainly. And the big dividing line is, it comes from outside is one, which would be ghosts, spirits, everything outside, and that would be through all societies. Now the poor and uneducated much more would have this one. It doesn't have, and then the other one is, it is an insight, comes from inside. So the evolved people, I won't call them elite, but the evolved people in every society, whether it is modern or traditional, believe it comes from within. So whether it is the Buddhist 14 causes, Hindu 5 causes, that inside, or psychoanalysis in that. So those are the dividing lines really. So whether you are poor or rich is not the important part, whether you can come for psychoanalysis or not, but whether in your whole system you have, according to psychoanalysis and others, identified the right cause of suffering, that it does not come from outside, it comes from inside.
So what final aspiration do you have for yourself, apart from writing great novels?
No, I don't have an aspiration at all of writing great novels. My aspirations are of doing things rather than of achieving things, because goals are not in your hand at all. My final aspiration is the same as which I've always had, which is increasing my capacity to experience, increasing my capacity to experience and not become dull. That is my final aspiration. That's all.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Rajiv.
That's been a great pleasure.
Thank you. Okay.